And so our exercise today is to work with this JSON data. Again, the URL is up at the top. This is on MDN Web Docs. And what I'm going to do essentially is not super complex, but I'm going to take this JSON data and take it in as a data source. And so we're kind of, in my mind, this is almost like, hey, pretending like the back end is sending JSON to our front end. Right, so we don't really have a back end yet to send us JSON. We will soon, but assumingly we'll get there, right? Where this back end is getting data out of a database and sending it to our front end on JSON. And then it's up to the front end to then display the data. So again, yesterday, if we kind of we dove a little bit into what is JSON. JSON, stands for JavaScript Object Notation, but it's not unique to JavaScript, right? A lot of languages can kind of work with data in a JSON format. And I just think of JSON as a transport method, right? Getting data from one point to another, kind of putting it in this format, okay? That looks like a JavaScript object. And so I'll go ahead and open up a folder here in Visual Studio Code. By the way, I'm on Windows 11. You're going to notice if I right click, I've got my old context menu. That was thanks to Tony, who did a little bit of research, found a command prompt command to throw into the command prompt. It's a little risky because it was modifying registry keys, and who knows if it's legit or not, but it was legit. Reboot the computer, and now my Windows 11 context menu, when I right click, looks like Windows 10, which makes me happy. I can now open with code with one click. I no longer need 2 clicks, and this makes me happy. It's an old website rule that you should be able to get anywhere on a website within 3 clicks. And so it's kind of like one of those things. I like minimal clicks. We all like minimal clicks. Okay, open up with code. And I'm going to boot this up with index.htm, and I'm going to have a main.js, and let's do data.json. These are our 3 files. Now for our HTML, I'm actually gonna go to getbootstrap.com, and I'm gonna bring in, if I go to the docs, so on the home page, click on this little docs link if you're following along, as I encourage you to do. Click on this docs and scroll down to step number 2, which gives you what's called the CDN, the Content Delivery Network, I believe, CDN for the Bootstrap CSS and the Bootstrap JavaScript. Go ahead and copy that to your clipboard and paste that in. Then change the lowercase doc type to a capital doc type to make our linter happy. And we should be off. Now the next thing I'll do is I will add another script tag. Let me take my cap locks off and type in the word script correctly. With a script source to my main.js. And I'll add the defer attribute, which is basically doing this. I no longer, this is how I look at the defer attribute. If you don't do this, right, it was traditional for a long time to put your scripts kind of at the end of the body, right? But this basically gets this script tag to load at the same time, kind of, I don't know if asynchronous is the right context here, but basically kind of get you to load your HTML and your JavaScript at the same time in memory. So you no longer have to put your script tags at the end of the body. And when you did that, you would also have to write like an event handler to on the page load, I want you to run this code. So the defer attribute kind of saves a couple of steps. You no longer basically need that event listener for the page load event. We could just go right in main.js and start coding. Now we do have this h1, and I'll just throw this on maybe I'll delete that. I'll do a div class of container, and then I'll do div with a class of row times 3, div.row times 3. Then I'm going to hit tab, and you get 3 divs with the class of row, and row 1, and row 2, and actually, well, what am I doing here? I'm thinking of row, but it should be call. I want 3 columns. I don't want 3 rows. I want 3 columns. So this is call 1, call 2, and call 3. Golly, come on. My brain needs to work with me this morning. Call 1, call 2, and call 3. Now, I also forgot the div with the class of row. So div.row, and okay. So if you go to the Bootstrap grid system, right? So I'll kind of show you the grid system. You want to start with the div class of row, and then you got your calls inside of it. And when you don't include numbers like this, Bootstrap just tries to figure out, well, how many columns do you have? And I'm going to try and fit it in that space. So I've got 1, 2, 3 columns. You can notice 1, 2, 3 columns inside of the row. And there's your little Bootstrap. And if you kind of boot that up in here, you can kind of basically notice we got our 3 columns. So Bootstrap is working. We got our 3 columns inside of a row. So they just kind of figure that out. So let me kind of go back to the code, because I know those of you guys following along. So we have our container. What does the container do? The container, you'll notice we no longer, if I highlight the container, check that out. You guys see what's going on my screen? I've got some margin on the left, and I've got some margin on the right. Okay, so by adding a container, it kind of justifies the white space on the left and the right, instead of, by default, all the white space is right justified. Right, so we add a container so that we kind of justify the white space, and if I click on toggle the device toolbar, you're going to notice this basically remains 3 columns, I mean, until it's like crazy small. So like a mobile device is probably something like this. This is still 3 columns. But what I would point out to you is that my container, more or less, it just kind of figures it out. Go ahead, yes.
When writing out the call 1, call 2, call 3, I noticed that there's an edit abbreviation for call, like there's an actual tag for COL.
There's a tag for COL?
Like how we have the div tag?
Yeah.
There's a tag for COL.
Okay. In HTML, you're saying there's a COL tag.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying?
That's what it says that there is, but
okay. So interesting. Maybe I'm just unfamiliar with the call tag, but yeah, in Bootstrap, you're using classes to create your calls. And so I'm not familiar with the call tag. There may be something newer that I'm not familiar with. Needless to say, I'm just basically getting this aligned here. Why don't we go ahead and throw in an H above all of this? I'll just do an H1, and I'll do a ID. I'll just call this main heading. And I'm not going to put any data in there. And it doesn't want an empty heading. My linter doesn't, but I'm going to use JavaScript to put some data in, okay? So, main heading. I guess I can do this and just say, okay. So main heading goes all the way across the screen because it is a block level element. 1, 2, 3, okay, 3 columns, and this is our page so far. Now I've got this data.json, and again, really what I'm going to do with this working with JSON article is I'm just going to get my JSON object kind of off of this article. You know, it's kind of interesting. I've got different properties and values, property values. I've got this member property with an array of objects. So I'm gonna want to loop through this array of objects and put this information maybe in like a Bootstrap card or something like that. But we'll get there, okay? So I'm just gonna copy this and I'll go into my data.json and paste. And then I can close my data.json file. Yeah, so the article was on right here. There's the URL for that data. Cool. Anyone else? Okay. So what I want to kind of do, and you probably don't remember, we didn't talk about the fetch API. But last semester we did a little bit. When I say we didn't talk about it much. But in JavaScript, this is a way of fetching data that a backend could serve up. Okay, and so you might remember this when I used this fetch API with a Pokemon example, right? If you remember last semester, I used this fetch API with, what was it, Pokemon API. And I kind of showed this and showed that, hey, there's this backend called the RESTful Pokemon API. And I showed last semester how to kind of tie into this. And look how cool JavaScript is and what you can kind of do with JavaScript.
That's
and
not something we didn't get.
What's that?
That's not something we defined.
No, that's okay. Actually, Mr. Gegelman, I know he did it because I saw it.
The RESTful API?
I know he did it because I saw it on your screen. That's okay. It's not important because here's, and I know some students in the class kind of like, oh wow, this fetch API is kind of neat. That you know, you can kind of find some resources on the web and pull them into your static HTML sites using JavaScript. So kind of to dig a little bit into this fetch API, the fetch API provides an interface for fetching resources across a network. So in the Ajax days, right, and still Ajax is semi-common, there was a different method called XML HTTP request, and so you might have heard of Ajax, right? And this fetch API kind of replaces working with data in Ajax. Ajax standing for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. Again, JSON is the newer way of transporting data than XML, right? So Ajax worked with XML. JSON, we're working with the fetch API. Okay, the fetch API uses objects in JavaScript called the request object and the response object, as well as some other network concepts related to cores, and which we'll talk about later on. Basically, you use this fetch method, right? It is a global method in both the windows. So the fetch method belongs to window. So just like the alert method, you don't have to say window.alert. You could just say alert. You could just call fetch. So we're just going to call fetch. The fetch method takes one mandatory argument, the path to the resource you want to fetch. It returns a promise. We're going to have to dig into what a promise is. That resolves to a response to that request as soon as the server responds with headers, even if the server response is an error message. Okay, so you could basically say, hey, we're going to call this fetch method, and the fetch method is going to give you back a response. You can convert that response into JSON. Okay, so it's here's kind of what that looks like. Okay, so let's bring this in. We're going to call the fetch method with one mandatory argument, which is we're going to go data.json. So this is calling the fetch method, and then the syntax here is then you say, upon this working, if this works, then you'll receive a response and convert it to JSON. If you successfully when you get that promise back, I should say, when you get that promise back, so response.json, this returns a promise. So it's like, hey, I'm going to give you data, because it's asynchronous, you don't know when you're going to get the data. But when it resolves, assuming it resolves successfully, now we get to the data. And so we can actually say, hey, console log data, okay? Now, in the event that any of this fails, you might remember a catch block, and we're gonna say, okay, if any of this doesn't work, let's catch the error and just log the error. So in the event that we have success, we're gonna log the data, and otherwise we should log some sort of error inside of our console. So we're going to say, hey, we're kind of going to get a response from the server, and we're going to take that response and try and extract the data. Like, hey, this JSON's like, you know, going to promise us some data out of it. And if that works, let's take the data and log it. Okay, so let's kind of go back into here. Let's go into inspect. Let's go into console. Hey, we got an object, and there it looks like a bunch of data. Right, so in our console, we have some data. So notice we have an object, and what do I want to do that with? I'm going to save that. I'm going to save that. Let what exactly is this data? This is some sort of superhero squad. Okay. So these are just made up superheroes. Does anyone recognize the name Molecule Man? No? Completely fictional. So these are the Avengers of some made up universe. So we'll just we're just gonna say Rankin Superheroes. Rankin Superhero Squad. Okay, so that's a heck of an identifier. Our variable is called Rankin Superhero Squad. And instead of just logging the data, let's set Rankin Superhero Squad equal to our data. And let's just console log. That is too long. I'm just gonna call this Rankin Squad. Rankin Squad, how about that? Rankin Squad, okay. Rankin Squad, console log, Rankin Squad dot, and we should have a squad name. Okay, so I'm just kind of piecing this together, and if I go back here, okay, so let's just go back a step here. Let's just log the Rankin Squad. That says undefined, and so I went I went wrong somewhere. So rank and squad, rank and squad, rank and squad. I might just need to refresh. Rank and squad, rank and squad, rank and squad. All right, where did I? What?
You don't need to parse it into a
Console log data. Okay, so there's my object. And so let me just console log rank and squad. Okay, so rank and squad does have, okay, so let's refresh. Okay, so this is basically running, okay. So this is working if I do it inside of the success, then we'll just continue on. So notice here, I no longer need a console log data. So here, rank and squad is data, console log rank and squad, there we go. Now if I do dot squad name, now it just says superhero squad. Okay, so you can kind of see we have our object, and through our object we can access its properties. We're getting the data out of the file, and we're saving it in the object. Now, what am I ultimately getting to? Now we need to get it in our front end, right? So how do we get it in our front end? Well, we've got this ID called main heading, and so we can script the DOM, right? Remembering a little bit of document get element by ID, squad name inner HTML equals, here we go. Document get element by ID, squad name, inner HTML, rank and squad dot squad name. And okay, so the ID is what? Main heading. So let's get the ID correct. The ID is main heading. And now you could see we're bringing it into the front end. Okay, now, you know, if you want to continue to do this on page load, you know, we might need to actually start bringing in some events in here, and, you know, you could do this on button click, so it's not just doing it all on page load, but I'm just going to keep doing it on page load. So here's what I'm kind of doing, is I'm going to bring this down to this, and I'm going to kind of bring that out so you can see. And let me zoom out just a little bit so you can see. Now everyone can see this okay on my screen? A little bit better that way, yeah? I'll give you guys a minute to type. Okay, so, you know, really then it becomes what data do we want to display, and what do we want to display it in, right? It's kind of completely subjective at this point. You know, we could say hometown, we could say formed, you know, we could put all this data on the page however we want to. I thought maybe, you know, just kind of keep this one short. You know, we're looking at a members array right here, right? And we've got one member here, another member here. It looks like each member has a powers array. So these, you know, this data is kind of deeply nested. We've got an array of objects, and then each object has a property with an array. But kind of at the base level, looking at one member, two members, three members. And so maybe we just take each member and put them in our columns is kind of what I'm thinking. What you can do, and a function you guys have been exposed to is the JavaScript mapping function. So this is, as we were learning about ways to loop over things, we've learned about the map function. And so you can kind of see, this is not the map that I'm thinking of. So let me back up here. Here's array prototype map. That's the one I'm looking for. So notice here's our array called array1 with some data, and we can map, and basically in this case it's transforming the data. So it's like, hey, for every element, multiply that element by 2 and store the resulting in an array called map1. And so if you output map1, you just get the double of all these numbers. 4 becomes 8, 9 becomes 18, 16 becomes 32. And so we can use the mapping function. Since map builds a new array, calling it without is kind of like using a loop. And so this is basically what we're looking at. Like, we're going to map over an array of objects and say for each product, we can do something with that product. So it's going to be kind of something like this, where here's our array of objects, and we can map over products. So what's our array of objects called? Obviously our array of objects is not called products. If I go back to our data, our array of objects is called members. So we're going to do members.map. So let's kind of back it in here. And Rankin Squad members.map. So let's kind of go here, Rankin Squad members, and you can kind of see for each, you could do a for each. Let's see, map each member. Now, scripting the DOM, right? So there's, I'm not a huge fan of scripting the DOM, right? But let's, we're going to need to create a call. We're going to need to create a div for each one of these. So I might delete these 3 columns. We can target our class of row and add a div. So for each member, let's create an element, and you can kind of see here, let new div equals create an element called div, new div dot inner HTML equals member.name. Now, let's just look at our data here. We do have a name. So this would, if I pull the page back over, hi. One second. Okay, but creating the new div and setting the inner HTML of the new div does not add it to the DOM, right? You still have to add it to our row. So I would append a child to our row, right? So I'm going to target, I'm just going to give this an ID of main, I'll just call it main row. So I'm going to say document dot get element by ID main row append child new div. Okay, and we're getting somewhere. We're getting somewhere, right? So we're mapping our array of objects for each member, or for each, I guess you could refactor this and call this for each hero. Then you need to change this to hero.name. We're going to create an element called, we're going to create a div. And let's do this. For our new div for each class, we're going to do new div class name, and we're going to add some Bootstrap, and here's a bunch of, how about call medium 4? Okay, that way our Bootstrap classes can still be applied here. And you can begin to pull this data out, put it into a page, and that's the demonstration that I wanted to give. I just wanted to pull some JSON data out, pretend like it's coming from a backend, because it will be coming from a backend pretty soon, and put it into a front end. And from there, this is kind of learning a little bit what we learned back in JavaScript, where we're scripting the DOM. Again, I don't love it, but it's the way it used to be done. Now there's the tools like React, and this is done quite a bit differently. But we are still, mapping. Map is something that we do all the time in React. Yes?
Could you scroll to the right?
Yes. Let me just, how about I do this? Okay. And I think you guys are at a point where, well, okay, you learn from this and you can do what you will with it. You've got a whole bunch of data and you have access to these properties. Well, then maybe you want to map each power too, right? So maybe, if you want to kind of take it to the next step, right? So we've got a hero, and then maybe we could say we want to do like a nested mapping of that hero's powers and put that inside of an unordered list. So you'd have to create an unordered list, create a bunch of list items for each power, map that out. So I think that's good enough for a starting demo today, but I wanted to clean that up. So we'll stop there.